Dr. Lindsay Taylor Goodharts is a scholar and teacher who has been teaching at the London School of Jewish Studies, the Orthodox College in northwest London, for many years. An anthropologist by training, she is the first British-born woman to receive smicha, ordination, from Yeshivat Maharat, a seminary in New York that has been ordaining Orthodox women since 2009. Her ordination and title of Rabbah, an alternative to rabbi, has provoked a strong reaction in the Anglo-Jewish community. The chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, under whose aegis the London School of Jewish Studies falls, has removed her title as research fellow and told her that she can no longer serve as a lecturer and teacher there. The Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, which advocates expanding women's rights, as well as many prominent modern Orthodox Jews, have declared their support for Rabbi Taylor Goodharts and feel that the chief rabbi has made a serious error of judgment. Rabbi Taylor Goodharts' ordination has made me reflect on the beginning of my own rabbinate and the changes that I and many women colleagues experienced in the early years of progressive women's ordination in this country. One woman rabbi working in a progressive community in the 1980s told me how the local Orthodox rabbi used to wind down the window of his car when he saw her and hurl insults at her. In the late 80s, as a new rabbi, I gave a sermon on Yom Kippur in which I said the following: I am moved by the beauty of the Yom Kippur liturgy, by the way it uses biblical quotations to exhort us to return to God, by the way it gives expression to the poverty of humanity's attributes compared to the might and compassion of God. But the image of man as an arrogant, deceitful, hard-hearted, authoritarian, lustful, malevolent, and ambitious creature does not necessarily, I said, embrace those sins and weaknesses that I find in myself and that I imagine other women would wish to confess. I suggested that our sins as women can sometimes be different. Sins of feeling too much guilt, of failing to acknowledge the validity of our feelings, of failing to act when we are treated condescendingly or with contempt, failing to assert our authority, or for being embarrassed by our age or our sex, our jobs, or our roles. The fallout from this sermon went in two directions. I was summoned first into the presence of the chairman of the synagogue, and then the senior rabbi, under whose authority I worked, and who were clearly angry and thought the sermon out of order. How dare I preach in that way, I was told. I barely touched the subject of women and Judaism in my sermons over the next few decades. I think I'm making up for it now, however. However, one rabbi, my former Bible teacher at Leobeck College, who was co-editing a new Reform Mahzor for the 3 Pilgrim festivals at the time, somehow got wind of the inflammatory sermon and published part of it in the study anthology in the section entitled Slavery and Freedom, where it remains to this day. I want to share this because when we read the Torah, We are often drawn to speak about the male characters, the patriarchs, Moses, Joshua, the judges, kings, and prophets, and in this week's parasha, the figure of Pinchas, after whom the Sedra is named, and who is rewarded for his violent killing of a Midianite princess, an Israelite man, whom he catches in flagrante delicto, stabbing them both through the belly. This rather grotesque story, told in a mere 4 verses, forms the conclusion to last week's parasha, but the consequences are picked up at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, with the account of God rewarding Pinchas for killing the couple and thus staying a plague which has broken out in the camp. There's always a virus or plague lurking somewhere in the Torah. God grants Pinchas a covenant of peace because, says the Torah, he took impassioned action, or he was jealous for his God. Vayichaper al bnei Yisrael, thus making expiation or atonement for the Israelites. And then the text does something rather unusual. Instead of allowing the woman to sink into anonymity, she is named along with the man. And we see that she is not simply a nobody, but Cosbi, daughter of Tsur, who is the tribal head of an ancestral house in Midian. And the whole episode becomes known as Devar Cosbi, the affair of Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite prince. Cosbi is one of 3 women in the Hebrew Bible who are singled out and violently put to death. She forms an unhappy company with Jephthah's daughter, whose father has made a vow to kill the first thing to emerge from his house after he has defeated the Ammonites. And another woman, an unnamed concubine, also in the book of Judges, who is raped and left for dead, then grotesquely cut up into pieces, which are posted around the country by her Levite husband. In an essay entitled Disembodied Bodies, its author Laura Monroe argues that the women all have one thing in common. The language that is used of their killing evokes terms that are used of sacrifice. Without going into too much detail, what do we make of the Israelite man who brings near Hikriv, a Midianite woman, the same word that is used of offering up a korban, a sacrifice? Why does Pinchas stab Cosbi, el kavata, through the belly, a term that is used for the part of the sacrificial victim, usually an animal, assigned to the priest? And why are we told that Pinchas's action makes atonement or expiation for the Israelites? These women, argues Monroe, all become sacrificial victims and scapegoats for the sins of Israel. Our Midianite princess in the Torah portion is identified with foreign women who entice Israelite men with sexual favors, and that then leads to idolatry. Of course, we know from other texts, such as the Akedah, with which there are similarities with some of the stories, that human sacrifice was utterly rejected by Israel. But the killing of these 3 women, designating them as scapegoats for the sins of Israel, are the traces that remain of earlier traditions of what Monroe calls heir sacrifices, H-E-I-R, the sacrifice of one's child and heir to one's name. Is it too far-fetched to say that Rabbi Dr. Taylor Goodhart's has been sacrificed for the sake of the so-called honor and petrified positions of Orthodox Judaism, that she has become a scapegoat to ensure that the ultra-Orthodox, who do not even come under the authority of the chief rabbi, will continue to look favorably on a modern orthodoxy free from the taint of women's authority, learning, and rabbinic titles. The three stories of the daughter of Jephthah, of Cosba, and the nameless concubine are among the most tragic and grotesque stories in Tanakh. We are repelled by them, and yet sadly, they reflect for us still a primitive fear of a woman's power and authority. Rabbi Lindsay's learning, graciousness, and determination remind us of another set of women in this week's parasha, the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, who challenge the law and succeed, allowing them to inherit their father's property after his death. There were 5 of them, 5 sisters, all working together to solve the problem of women's disinheritance. We cannot rely solely on the strength of Rabbi Lindsay, as with so many different issues that transgress human dignity and justice. We all have a responsibility to resist and erase completely these traces of sacrifice and scapegoating. We cannot afford to mutilate the dynamic future of our people on the altar of a fossilized faith.